Hi, everyone. Welcome to the ManageIQ Sprint 165 review. This was a regular 2-week sprint, but there was the Independence Day holiday in between. So as always, I will provide the overview. Kavya will update us on the UI, Adam on the providers, and Jason on the platform, the API, and the developer stuff. All right, so this sprint, we started nudging back up to more pull requests opened as well as merged. I think these result, I've been trying to analyze, I think these result in when we have a lot of blast outs to a number of repositories at the same time. They kind of count for a bunch. So I think there was some provider work that kind of hit, all of the provider repos at once. So when they all get merged, the scores go up. All right, and then in the pull requests by label, the sprint, we had 45 enhancements versus 22 bugs, and the rest in refactoring and tech debt, etc. And with that, I will turn it over to Kavya.
Yep, thanks, Oleg. Good afternoon, everyone. This sprint total 9 POs got merged into UI repos, 4 bugs, 4 enhancements, and so on. Next slide, please. Here, add new host initiator form has bug. So port type dropdown is not working before. So one of the community users fixed that issue. This is that. Next slide, please. In add new policy, there was an error when trying to select options for applies to field. Fixed that issue here. Next slide, please. Here, Nick added verify SSL checkbox on embedded Ansible repositories form. Next slide, please. Here, before this PR, whenever there is a notification on save or any other action, page is not scrolling to top automatically. For example, in the screenshot we have is my settings page. And if we change something in that page and click save, page is not scrolling to top. So we don't know whether form got saved or if there is an error, we don't know. So we have to manually scroll to top to see that. Now page scrolls automatically. Next slide, please. This is an enhancement. Time profiles pages, time profiles create, edit, and copy form is converted to Carbon and DDF. Next slide, please. Here, upgraded DDF version package from version 2 to version 3. This is very much necessary to do because very soon DDF stops supporting bug fixes for version 2. So if we want to have all those changes for us, we have to be in version 3. Like for last couple of weeks, we raised like at least 4 issues and DDF team fixed them immediately. But just for us, they're again raising new PR to version 2 repos, and it is just painful process for them as well. So this PR will avoid all of that. And yeah, I think that's all from UI. With that, over to Adam.
Thanks, Kavya. So this sprint for providers in core, we fixed provider deletion appearing to hang if there are a lot of queue messages. This was the result of if workers are still running and putting new items on the queue, it makes it much harder for the queue to destroy to get processed. So what we do now is QA pause with high priority, which causes all of the workers to shut down and stop adding items to the queue. So it makes it a lot more seemingly faster for the provider to get deleted when it's not getting backed up behind a bunch of other queue items while the provider's still running. We also simplified the pause and resume actions for providers. This was previously done with some Rails callbacks, and it was just kind of difficult to figure out what was going on, where now we just call it as part of a regular loop when you're actually pausing it at the parent manager. Just loop to the child managers to pause and resume all of those. There was a little bit of refactoring that came out of that first one. We also fixed an issue where the core, the base VM class, had supports migrate with a couple of checks to see that if the VM was attached to a live provider. The downside of this is that every provider VM appeared to support migrate, which only 2 of them did. So we fixed that up. We deleted that from core and moved the check down to only the VMware and the overt classes were the only 2 that actually support live migrate for VMs. NASA fixed a bunch of duplicate methods that had been copied in a number of providers. I think what happened was OpenStack initially wrote this in their own provider, and then it got copied and pasted a couple of times. So there's an issue where these methods are actually common. They're not provider dependent, and so they should be in the base class, and only the provider implement the raw method, which is the common pattern. A bunch of the network methods were not following this pattern, and each provider implemented their own queue method. So NASA fixed that for create and delete cloud subnets. Keenan also worked, and this is what Oleg was talking about. Keenan went through all of the provider systemd unit files to add properties files so that we can get away from having to load the bash logon shell for the provider workers. All of the environment variables are loaded statically from files, which is part of the ongoing work to simplify the systemd units and also run them as non-root workers. Next slide. For Amazon, we fixed an issue where the dependent destroy of the Amazon Network Manager wasn't occurring. This was fallout from the refactoring in the original and core, where the provider workers are being explicitly destroyed. We're actually overwriting the Rails built-in destroy method and then dumping a whole bunch of extra logic into there. So we simplified that by calling a separate method for destroy, but then we noticed that Amazon was depending on that kind of extra logic in the overridden destroy method. So we just fixed that up right there. For IBM Cloud VPC, NASA added support for deleting cloud subnets and cloud networks. We're going through and working on adding operations for a bunch of the cloud and network entity types. And so these are the two that landed this sprint. We also fixed VPC flavors didn't have any STI class. They were just nil. So they look like the base flavors class. So we fixed this in the refresher and also added a schema migration to fix any existing flavors that were in the database. For the Power VS side, there was a method called tenant ID, which was supposed to be the Power VS tenant. Inadvertently was overwriting the tenant ID in the database. And so anytime that the API was doing a query to get the tenant ID for all providers, Power VS was actually going out and making a live API call to IBM Cloud from the API pod, which is obviously a big problem. So we renamed that method so that it's not actually going out and doing an API call anymore. Next slide. So new standalone storage manager of the sprint, there's support for IBM Cloud Object Storage. This is part of the import image work that the Power team has been doing. So hopefully we can get a demo next sprint of this provider, since it is can be added standalone. It's intended to be used as part of a broader feature, but it would be nice to see some of the capabilities of this. This joins a couple of the other standalone storage managers, but this is actually the first standalone object storage manager, which is pretty cool. For IBM Power VC, they fixed the new provider registration form. There were a couple of issues that were present in that it was subclass from OpenStack, but they don't actually support all the different things that OpenStack does. So they clean this up a little bit so that you only see the things that Power VC supports. For actually both Kubernetes and VMware, there is a bug that was noticed where if you change the endpoint or credentials for a provider, these two providers didn't have their refresh worker restarted. This is because most refreshes historically had been queued. And so the next time the worker ran a refresh, it would reload the new credentials. But with the advent of streaming refresh, both of these types of workers were holding a persistent connection open. And so the worker has to be restarted to pick up the new credentials. So we fixed that bug with these two providers this sprint. And also some of the ongoing work of reducing the technical debt in the VMware Web Service gem. It had been using the global Vim log from core throughout the code and then checking to see if Vim log was nil. We replaced that with a logger method, a gem logger method, and then got rid of all the conditionals. That way we're not assuming a lot of extra knowledge about where this gem might be loaded from. And that's it for providers. Over to Jason.
Okay, on the platform side, we had a number of enhancements this sprint. First one is Adam added a change to use the prog name rather than syslog identifier for journal D logs. This is a follow-up to last sprint's change where we started adding in the log name into the container logger. And so this is the parallel change for journal D logs. Nick Lamuro added a virtual attribute for verify SSL for embedded Ansible. Kavya showed the UI portion of that. This is the backend portion of that. CoolDip added shared processor and entitled processor fields to the advanced settings for reporting. So when you're building reports with advanced settings, you can see those two new fields. And Deepak added build changes so we can start building on Z. And specifically the Python 3 overt engine RPM was added. And then Keenan had a number of changes for the work that he's doing for getting us away from using the root user. So this sprint was changes like adding services, adding the manage IQ user, the group, changing the ownership of various files. And additionally, he did some work for protecting secrets so that they can be used properly by manage IQ user and group. Next slide, please. For bugs, Nick fixed an issue where specifically in Podify, but it also overlapped a bit with Keenan's root work, where the Ansible config was stored in root's home directory, but when you're no longer running as root, or if you're in Podify where you're not running as root, Ansible would try to create tempters in that directory and it wouldn't have permissions to. So he switched to using Ansible local temp and Ansible remote temp. Joe fixed an issue where after we upgraded DALI, which is our memcached gem, a method that we were depending on no longer existed. And so that ended up causing locks in the UI, specifically in development mode. So he went and found those, fixed those up and made sure that we, the methods that we're patching are there in the future. So if we ever see changes like that again, it won't happen again. Gilbert fixed an issue with time profiles where days and hours would essentially not come through the API properly because we were using symbols instead of strings, and the API can only serialize on strings. So this fix allows that to work, and there'll probably be future changes there, so we'll stop using symbols inside the database as well. And finally, Kavya added a fix for the report results screen where the view data feature was missing in product features. This is a follow-on from Joe's change where we're trying to detect all these missing features, and this was one of the ones that was found. Next slide, please. On the API side, Mingxi added the MIQ SNMP types on the API actions endpoint. So if you send an options call to the API actions endpoint, previously we only brought back the action types, but now specifically for SNMP trap, we also bring back the options that are needed for the selection box for SNMP traps. Next slide, please. And finally, on the developer side, Joe did a lot of changes for getting logical replication working on a local development machine where the global region and the remote regions live in the same cluster. There's some interesting oddities with Postgres that he ran into. And so these changes are a lot to deal with those oddities when running on a local cluster. But that work's all been completed. So if you follow his guide, which is the first link, you should be able to get logical replication working locally for development purposes. And that's it for me.
All right. And with that, sprint 165 review comes to a close. Next sprint review is in 2 weeks at the same time, same place. And I want to thank everyone, the contributors, the speakers, and the community. And see you all next time.